Hi everyone. Today our scripture reading is Genesis chapter 26, verse 12 through chapter 27, 4. Isaac planted crops in that land, and the same year reaped 100-fold, because the Lord blessed him. The man became rich, and his wealth continued to grow until he became very wealthy. He had so many flocks and herds and servants that the Philistines envied him. So all the wells that his father's servants had dug in the time of his father Abraham, the Philistines stopped up, filling them with the earth. Then Abimelech said to Isaac, "Move away from us. You have become too powerful for us." So Isaac moved away from there and encamped in the valley of Gerar, where he settled. Isaac reopened the wells that had been dug in the time of his father Abraham, which the Philistines had stopped up after Abraham died, and he gave them the same names his father had given them. Isaac's servants dug in the valley and discovered a well of fresh water there, but the herders of Gerar quarreled with those of Isaac and said, "The water is ours." So he named the well Esek, because they disputed with him. Then they dug another well, but they quarreled over that one also, so he named it Sitnah. He moved on from there and dug another well, and no one quarreled over it. He named it Rehoboth, saying, "Now the Lord has given us room, and we will flourish in the land." From there he went up to Beersheba. That night the Lord appeared to him and said, "I am the God of your father Abraham. Do not be afraid, for I am with you. I will bless you, and will increase the number of your descendants for the sake of my servant Abraham." Isaac built an altar there and called on the name of the Lord. There he pitched his tent, and there his servants dug a well. Meanwhile, Abimelech had come to him from Gerar, with Ahuzath, his personal advisor, and Phicol, the commander of his forces. Isaac asked them, "Why have you come to me, since you were hostile to me and sent me away?" They answered, "We saw clearly that the Lord was with you. So we said, there ought to be a sworn agreement between us and you. Let us make a treaty with you, that you will do us no harm, just as we did not harm you, but always treated you well, and sent you away peacefully. And now you are blessed by the Lord." Isaac then made a feast for them, and they ate and drank. Early the next morning the men swore an oath to each other. Then Isaac sent them on their way, and they went away peacefully. That day Isaac's servants came and told him about the well they had dug. They said, "We've found water." He called it Sheba, and to this day the name of the town has been Beersheba. When Esau was 40 years old, he married Judith, daughter of Beeri the Hittite, and also Basemath, daughter of Elon the Hittite. They were a source of grief to Isaac and Rebekah. When Isaac was old and his eyes were so weak that he could no longer see, he called for Esau his son and said to him, "My son." "Here I am," he answered. Isaac said, "I am now an old man and don't know the day of my death. Now then, get your equipment, your quiver and bow, and go out to the open country to hunt some wild game for me. Prepare me the kind of tasty food I like and bring it to me to eat, so that I may give you my blessing before I die." The word of God for the people of God. Have you ever wondered, why were Isaac's eyes so bad? Now, maybe you've just assumed the answer is obvious. We're told Isaac was old and his eyes were so weak that he could no longer see, and that makes a whole lot of sense. As people grow older, their vision tends to get worse. My mom is in her 90s and she has to get shots in her eyes every so many weeks to keep her vision strong. So Isaac's eyes being bad as a result of his age just makes sense. And yet, for some reason, one ancient Jewish sage puts out a different reason for why Isaac's eyes were so bad. This unnamed sage tells an alternate story about the day Abraham almost sacrificed Isaac on top of that mountain. He says that on that day, in the very hour that Abraham bound up Isaac and prepared to sacrifice him, in that very hour, the angels who were watching from heaven were struck by the sight, and not knowing what would happen next, they began to cry. The tears fell from the eyes of the angels and fell into the eyes of Isaac as he lay there on the altar. And as the sage tells it, these tears left traces in his eyes. so that one day, after much time had passed, Isaac's eyes grew weak. So, just for you to think about at home, do you think Isaac's eyes were bad purely because of old age? Or do you think Isaac's eyes were bad because of angel's tears plus time? Me personally, put me in the old age camp. This other story about the angel's tears, I don't see it anywhere in the text, and it's a bit too fantastical for me. I might be wrong, but yeah, the story is just weird. But let's forget about Isaac's bad eyes for the moment, and let's focus instead on his years when his eyes were supposedly healthy. So the story we read today, it opens just after King Abimelech caught Isaac and Rebekah in a lie about their relationship. If you remember, there was a famine, and so Isaac chose to stay in a place called Gerar, and he lied and said his wife was actually his sister, and his dad had done this before, but there are some subtle differences. For one, Abraham went down to Egypt, but this time around God warned Isaac not to go down to Egypt and instead stay in this land God had promised to give to him and to his descendants, and so Isaac stays. But then after the lying, and after the cautious Abimelech's suspicions were proved correct, we see Abimelech is merciful and allows Isaac to stay in town. Their relationship is still salvageable at this point because of King Abimelech. And at this point, we get to what we read, and we see another subtle difference. Whereas Abraham came away from Egypt with a lot of stuff because of his lies and because he unintentionally sold his wife to Pharaoh, here we see Isaac plants his own crops, and God greatly blesses his harvest. Isaac became rich and wealthy just like his dad had become in Egypt, except he does it not by hurting and stealing from others, but by trusting God. Not perfectly, of course, but clearly his initial ruse, it didn't work, and so the blessing he did receive was purely from God and not tainted by his wicked efforts. And it's a great moment here for God's plan to bless the world through this family. But then the story takes another turn. Isaac becomes so wealthy and blessed that his neighbors grow envious, and out of that envy they begin to act out against Isaac, and they start filling in the wells that Isaac has inherited, the wells his dad had dug. And now the king of those neighbors, Abimelech, who knows if Abimelech is holding a grudge still, or if he's envious himself, or maybe he's just trying to keep the peace. But Abimelech comes to Isaac and asks him to move away. And so Isaac does the neighborly thing and moves away. And as we will come to see, their relationship once again remains salvageable, this time because of Isaac. But so Isaac moves away, and by that it seems to just mean no longer lives right there in town with the king and his people, because clearly he hasn't moved all that far away. He leaves Gerar, or someplace located in the region of Gerar, and he goes and camps in the valley of Gerar. And he actually settles there, which, hey, God told him to stay in this region after all. And at this point, Isaac has his servants start redigging and reopening those wells that his father Abraham had dug up. Right? Those wells which, if you remember, his neighbors had just filled in with dirt. And just stop again and think, how many of you are upset by this? You're offended by this injustice. This would be like if someone intentionally crashed into your car, but then you had to completely pay for the damage that they had caused to your car. That's not fair, that's not right, that's not justice. But it gets worse, because after Isaac reopens those wells, he then decides to go and dig some more. But after discovering one, and after his people do all the hard work of digging, his neighbors now show up and claim that it is their well. And it would be like if after fixing your car, you started saving up money again, working hard until you finally have enough to buy a second car for your family. And then your neighbor, that same neighbor who unapologetically and you suspect intentionally crashed into your car earlier and refused to pay a cent, that neighbor now shows up and starts arguing with you in your driveway, claiming that that new car is actually his. And therefore, you need to hand the keys over. And remarkably, that's what Isaac does. Not once, but twice. He digs and finds water. His neighbor then shows up and claims it is his. The water is ours. And then after some arguing, Isaac just seems to shrug his shoulders and walk off to start digging another hole. And it all happens again, complete with Isaac being the one to walk away. But then finally, after Isaac moved on from there, he dug yet another well, which I would have given up by then, but Isaac keeps digging, and this time he finds peace. And Isaac praises God for giving him enough room in the land to flourish peacefully. Living with others, it can be really difficult, whether in the same land or the same house. I remember when I first moved into my college house of 3 years, me and my 7 other roommates, we had to set a lot of ground rules and then adapt them as we went on. Now, some guidelines went a bit unspoken, such as how much fridge or freezer space a roommate could take up. And if you took up too much, then typically you were going to get met with passive-aggressive comments or direct confrontation. And then other times we made actual rules. Like in the downstairs, the 3 of us, we marked off part of our counter where we could put our dirty dishes. Because we kept finding that too often our sink was too full of dirty dishes for people to do their dishes, and nobody wanted to do someone else's dishes, so we tried to work out a fair system. But then also coming in, we were suddenly combining 8 different people's property under one roof. And we were only college students, so it's not like we had very much, but still, sometimes our phone or computer chargers looked the same, and so we'd argue about whose was whose while each playing detective. Or there were multiple Xboxes and Nintendo Wiis, and so was yours the Wii that sometimes froze, or was yours the Wii that worked perfectly fine? And there were weekly battles over whose dishes were whose dishes, mainly upstairs, because we kind of had our system downstairs. But then there was also this daily silent battle over who got to end up in the coveted parking spots at the front of the house. And I remember early on, I started writing my name on things to help keep track. Right? I didn't have much, but I started writing my name on whatever I did own. My Wii games, my books, my DVD collections, items I bought with my own money or received as presents. I started focusing on me and mine, protecting me and mine. And then some of my roommates and I, we started attending this Bible study that we absolutely loved, but it was a 45-minute drive one way, and so we would carpool. But I was so focused on me and mine, and I started to notice every time that I had to drive. Like, I started keeping track in my head because it felt like I had to drive more often than anyone else, and that's partly because I had a Prius, but whenever it was my turn, I was fine with it, but whenever it wasn't supposed to be my turn, but still I was asked to drive, I'd put up a fuss, and then eventually I'd reluctantly agree, and then I'd have this bad attitude the whole time driving a Bible study, and I'd be mostly silent, fuming inside, and if I had to say anything, my responses would be curt. And then sometimes my roommates would notice my bad attitude, which made me more upset. Well, other times they didn't seem to notice that I was upset, which also made me more upset. Because living with others can be really difficult. We want to protect me and mine. Isaac, however, didn't spend time writing his name on everything. I'm not saying he didn't argue or he didn't get upset, but when push came to shove, Isaac chose the way of peace and gave up his property. He gave up the wells he had dug, and he even gave up his land. God had promised to give Abraham and now Isaac this entire land. And from Isaac's perspective, Abimelech and his people, they were just short-term tenants. And yet when Abimelech asked him to leave, Isaac didn't fight. He just left. Rather than trying to hold on to his inheritance and all that he owned with a fierce grip, he simply released it and let others take it from him. Rather than pursuing wealth and resources and stuff with toxic desperation, he sought to perform his inherited role as God's Behor, as God's representative, showing off God's generosity and hospitality to the other peoples. Rather than focusing on me and mine, Isaac remembered his mission, to partner with God in blessing all the peoples of the world. And that blessing, it was happening here in the story. Because maybe it was at the tail end of the famine or just after it had ended, but Isaac had this huge harvest of food, and I'm sure that went to help the people of that land recover. And then even as the people of that land, they were filling in the wells and removing their water sources. Well, Isaac, he kept digging new ones and reopening the old ones and allowing others to have them. And if we want to participate in our God-given calling and mission, then it cannot just be about attending worship on Sunday mornings. There's more to faith than just getting together with other believers for Sunday school and Bible studies. We can't just get by on reading our Bibles and praying at dinner time. And it even goes beyond just evangelism and telling people about Jesus. Like if we're going to participate in that mission to bless the world, and if we're going to serve as God's behors, showing off God's generosity and hospitality, then we need to follow in Isaac's footsteps. We need to loosen our grip on our own possessions and wealth and resources. At least, that's what Jesus says. In his Sermon on the Mount, Jesus, he's laying out for his followers how they can participate in the kingdom of heaven and in the mission to bring about God's blessing and goodness in this world. And so Jesus teaches, do not store up for yourselves treasures on earth, where moths and vermin destroy and where thieves break in and steal, but store up for yourselves treasure in heaven, where moths and vermin do not destroy, and where thieves do not break in and steal. For where your treasure is, there your heart will be also. Jesus, he's saying, stop focusing so much on the things that are ultimately going to pass away. Stop focusing on money and cars and houses and DVDs and stuff. And a few paragraphs later, Jesus is going to teach his followers not to worry about their own lives, and to not spend their entire lives being consumed by worry for what they will eat and drink and wear. Because that worry, Jesus knows that worry, it's going to eat away at them and cause them to act a certain way towards others. That worry, it's going to make them so focused on the money they are spending on gas that it's going to take away from their relationships with their roommates. So Jesus says, stop focusing on and worrying about that stuff, your stuff. Instead, store up for yourselves treasure in heaven, aka focus on those parts of this life which will be a part of the kingdom to come, and which already are a part of this kingdom. Jesus is saying to focus on people and on relationships and on those fruits of the Spirit that Paul talks about, love and joy and peace and all of those. To Jesus, all of those, and especially people, are much more valuable than gold or diamonds or cars or houses. And Jesus also wants those to be of highest importance to his followers, because what we value most will have an unmeasurable impact on our ability to love God and love others. For where your treasure is, there your heart will be also. And just after talking about the treasure in heaven, Jesus says, the eye is the lamp of the body. If your eyes are healthy, your whole body will be full of light. Now here Jesus, he's using this common Hebrew idiom called ayim tovah, or good eye. Now in baseball, we say a batter has a good eye when they don't swing at a pitch outside of the strike zone. But in rabbinical Judaism, they speak of a person having a good eye when they view the world through a goodness lens, or when they view the world through a focus on what God is doing. It's similar to having a glass half full mindset, except this isn't optimism that things are just going to work out through sheer good luck or magic. This is an optimism born of faith in a God who you believe and trust is working here and now to make all things right in the world. This is a worldview that comes from trusting the story. God is telling us in our world this story of love and trust and acceptance and second chances and forgiveness. And when we trust that story, it affects how we see the world, which impacts who we are inwardly. It impacts the kind of people we are becoming. As Jesus says, if our eyes are good and healthy, then the whole world will be full of light. We will be so focused on the goodness that God is bringing about in our world that we're going to find we're willing to take big risks and give of ourselves. We will see this world as a place of abundance and enough, and we will live lives of generosity, and this is the kind of eye and the kind of faith that Isaac had. See, despite all of the difficulty and despite all the injustice he sustained, despite all of the unearned hostility and envy that directed his way, Isaac just kept moving and just kept digging and just kept staying in the land he had been called to stay in. And Isaac kept trusting God to take care of him and his household. And it freed him up to live a life of generosity. But having a good eye, it goes beyond just being generous with our physical possessions. It impacts every single aspect of our entire life. It impacts our view of cleaning the dishes. It impacts our how we feel when our favorite parking spot is already taken. It impacts what and who we spend our money on and how we spend our time with family and friends. It impacts everything about our lives because it impacts how we treat God, how we treat other people, and how we treat ourselves. It impacts what we say to ourselves when we make a mistake, and what we say to others when they hurt us, and what we say to God when it's been quite a while since the last time we spoke to Him. If we trust the story, then we know God is not waiting for us with arms crossed, constantly checking His watch. Instead, we realize God is waiting with open arms. And having a good eye, it impacts our ability to forgive. After some time, Abimelech showed up on Isaac's doorstep, and curious and clearly still miffed about what happened earlier, Isaac asked him, "Hey, why have you come here? Since you were hostile to me before, and you sent me away." And Abimelech and his council, they answer, "Hey, we can tell that the Lord is with you, and at least we sent you away peacefully. So let's make a treaty between us. Let's keep this peace between us." And would you accept this non-apology? If you say you would, then either you have a good eye, or at least when it comes to this situation, or you're fibbing a bit. But good eye Isaac gives up his right to be angry and frustrated and bitter, and instead he accepts their offer and makes a feast for his visitors, just as Abraham once had. And after eating and drinking, they retire for the night. And the next morning, they wake up and they make their covenant, and then they depart from one another's presence peacefully. And almost as if God was celebrating or encouraging Isaac for his actions and decisions, Isaac's servants show up excited and reveal they found more water. The story with Isaac and Abimelech, it's one of hope. Hope for what the world could be like if people are placing their trust in God and the story God is telling. The story teaches us that God's generosity and forgiveness, it breeds our own generosity and forgiveness, which produces peace and friendship in the world. Because before Isaac and Abimelech could make their covenant, Isaac had to forgive Abimelech. And before Isaac forgave Abimelech, Abimelech had to forgive Isaac for lying to him, which, if you remember, salvaged their relationship. And way back before Abimelech forgave Isaac, Abimelech himself was forgiven by God. When Abimelech, or at least his father, had taken Sarah from Abraham, God gave him the chance to repent, and then God healed him and his household. God's forgiveness breeds forgiveness in people. It even bred forgiveness in Abimelech, who did not claim to worship God. So with that being said, does it breed forgiveness in us? Does it breed forgiveness and a good eye in you? Now that story with Isaac and Abimelech, it's one of hope and one of good eyes, which is good, and it's something we need to hold on to. It's a hopeful story. But the next story, Isaac's eyes turned bad. See, when Isaac was old and his eyes were so weak that he could no longer see, he called for Esau, his older son. And he tells him, "Hey, Esau, I don't know when I'm going to die, but I want to bless you. So go out and hunt, and then come back and make a meal for me, so that I may eat, and then I may give you my blessing before I die." And we dealt with this story way back in May, focusing on Rebekah's perspective. But if you remember, Isaac was the one who named Jacob Jacob. He named him Deceiver, Heel Grasper. He gave him a messed up name. And after naming him, we're told another peculiar thing, that Isaac loved Esau, as in Isaac got Esau. He understood him, he favored him over Jacob, to the extent that it was almost as if he didn't love Jacob. And we want to say, well, of course he loved Jacob. He was his dad. But then we remember that awful name he gave him, and then we realize that Isaac called for Esau so that he could bless him before he died. Yet Isaac didn't call for his other son, Jacob. Like, was Isaac okay dying before he blessed Jacob? Did he have any plans to bless Jacob? And you keep reading the story and you realize, no, Isaac had no intentions of wasting his time crafting and giving a blessing to Jacob. But why would he waste his valuable time on a disappointment like Jacob? And it's here in this next story where all those good feelings that we had about Isaac, they just seem to vanish. Like Isaac has gone from having a good eye to a bad eye. Or at least he has a bad eye when it comes to this one son of his. But when it comes to this one son, Jacob, Isaac does not see a story of possibility and redemption. He doesn't see a story of Jacob being enough. Instead of a story of abundance, Isaac looks at Jacob and he sees a story of scarcity, where he only has a limited amount of blessing to give away, and so he might as well give it all to his one son, the one son he knows won't disappoint him. He wants to give it all to the one son who he trusts to be his Behor and to carry on his family's name, even if there's then nothing left to give that other son. Like, it doesn't matter how much Jacob wants it, he can't be trusted. Now we didn't read, but I told you about a weird story from an ancient Jewish sage at the beginning. One with angels' tears falling into Isaac's eyes. And sometimes those ancient Jewish sages, they're trying to tell us what they think actually happened based on subtle hints and clues in the text. But other times, those ancient Jewish sages are instead trying to leave their own subtle hints and clues for us about what they think is really going on. See, we've already explored how traumatic that mountaintop experience must have been for Isaac. But through that ancient sage's story, we're invited to further reflect on that trauma, the long-term effects it must have had on Isaac. Perhaps Isaac's physical blindness was just from old age. But what about Isaac's spiritual and emotional blindness when it came to Jacob? What about Isaac's bad eye? Did that come from old age? Or did that come from some prior experiences Isaac had once had? Was his bad eye towards Jacob something he inherited? Of course, whether Isaac's bad eye was inherited from Abraham and that mountaintop experience, it's not something we can say with certainty. But what about Jacob's bad eye? See, Jacob lived up to his dad-given name when he deceived his father, stealing his brother's blessing. As Esau would say, is he not rightly named Jacob? But was Jacob rightly named? Or did Jacob just live into the name he was given? If Isaac had treated Jacob differently, if he had named him something different, how many of the following tragedy-filled chapters could we have skipped? As disciples, we recognize that God asks us not just to own and embrace the faith for ourselves, but also to do our best to pass it along to others. To do what we can to guide our children and family and friends, and then at a certain point to release, to let go, to take our hands off the bicycle and let them try to do it on their own, even though we know that they're going to crash and fall down a bunch of times just like we did and just like we still do. But sometimes we don't, sometimes I don't think we realize what exactly we're passing on. Like sometimes we think we're passing on faith when in reality we're just passing on a Sunday morning tradition. And sometimes we think we're passing on faith when in reality the story we're telling to our loved ones is not the story that God is telling to this world. And then that inheritance we're handing them is now something that could end up gnawing away at them for years and years to come. See, when we pass on faith, we're not just passing on a choice or a decision. We're passing on a way of life, a way of living, a way of relating to God and to other people and to the world, and passing that on, it's not easy because we haven't mastered it ourselves. But maybe for the sake of those we love, we can make the effort to be a little more aware of what we are passing on. And ultimately, we can't pass on to others what we do not already have ourselves. So, does your faith in Jesus and your trust in God's story and God's forgiveness in your life, does it bear in you love and joy and peace and the rest of the fruits that come from the Holy Spirit? Does it breed forgiveness and generosity and compassion in your heart? Does it create in you a high value and appreciation for relationships and people? Is your faith transforming you and producing a good eye in you? If it's not, then either you're not truly owning your faith, not yet, or you're believing the wrong story. And maybe you were handed the wrong story growing up and you just haven't been ready or able to release it. Not yet. Either way, whether you haven't owned it yet or you've been listening to the wrong story, there's still time. Our God is a God who gives second, third, and fourth chances. Our God walks with us as we wrestle with our own stories. And our God waits for us with open arms. Because that's who our God is. And that's the story our God is asking us to tell the world as his behoors. My simple prayer for you today is that you are hearing the story that God is telling. And that, as you go on from here, that you go telling this story to the world. Amen.